of kind of a larger series of events we're doing this weekend with our chapters at NYU and Columbia. I'm the head of the Columbia chapter. That's where I learn, go to school, work, and that sort of stuff. And tomorrow morning at 11 a.m. at Columbia University in Mathematics 507, we'll be having a discussion with Coleman Hughes and Jim Cregan about the legacy of Bayard Rustin. And then at 2 p.m. in Jerome Green Hall in 104 at Columbia University, we'll be having a panel on the American Revolution. We'll also be back in this room tomorrow at 7 to talk a bit about Platypus and what Platypus is trying to do in our educational project on campus. So you're all invited to attend any of that. But as soon as I start this recording, okay, without further ado, Spencer Leonard.
Hi, everybody. Hello. Just a few comments. The title of this talk is a bit misleading. It's become sort of a chestnut in really the last couple of decades, but it dates back to the way that Marx's writings were published in the 20th century, particularly a body of work that I've been closely acquainting myself with in the last few years, Marx's journalism of the 1850s, which I'm currently editing a selection of. That work was published in a sort of national roads to socialism mode. So you got Marx on China, Marx on India, Marx on the American Civil War, that Marx on Ireland and the Irish question, which was drawing heavily on Marx's journalism. Just to say a bit about what that journalism was, in 1849, Marx went into exile in London, as many of you may know. And exile politics really dominated his and Engels' life, and for a time they were expecting the renewal of the revolution on the continent. In Platypus, we read Marx's address to the Communist League of 1850, and that, of course, is anticipating that renewal, which did not come to pass. And instead, what Marx viewed as an event that forced him to radically reconceive his conception of ultimately the historical dialectic itself. Of course, it was a culmination of many events. The coup d'etat of Louis Bonaparte took place in December of 1851. And as I say, already in this, it's anticipating that need to seriously reconsider, and the prospect of the revolution not being renewed anytime soon on the continent prompted Marx and Engels to need to find a job, forced them to confront that. Of course, also the complete exhaustion of their resources forced them to confront that. And Marx took a job as a journalist for the New York Tribune, which was, of course, published here in New York. It was edited by Horace Greeley, who was a kind of abolitionist and utopian socialist, who had dispatched a Fourierist comrade, a man named Charles Dana, to cover the revolution of 1848. And he had met Marx at the time when he was publishing the Neue Rheinische Zeitung as part of his revolutionary activity. And he reached out to Marx, asking if he wanted to serve as London correspondent. I don't know why Charles Dana thought Marx could write in English, Maybe Marx knew English well enough to speak to him in English at the time he met him, but I don't believe so. I believe that Dana's German would have been better. At any rate, Marx couldn't write in English, and he first of all asked Engels to do it all. I'm studying. I've got this job, so you please do it. Which Engels did. Wrote a series of 18 articles called Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Germany in English. Engels is English, of course, being fluent. And Marx began to write in German, sending articles to Engels to be translated, and then within about 6 months, Marx being a fairly quick study, he started to write in English. So much so that by 1855, when he got an invitation to write for a paper in Germany, or I think in Austria, he wrote back to the editor and he said, I don't know if I can write in German anymore. He said that quite honestly. I'm an English journalist. So Marx picked it up pretty quick. But the result is about 7 or 8 volumes of Marx's collected works in predominantly English, though he did also write for a range of other papers. He wrote briefly for a newspaper in South Africa. He wrote for the German Workers' Educational Association in London, which published a paper called Das Volk in German in London. He published for a paper called Die Presse in 1861-62, which is important for what I'm going to talk about now, because that was the last job that he had as a professional journalist, and the one that he, in other words, his writing for the New York Tribune ended before his writing for Die Presse did, and so some of the most important pieces that we have on the American Civil War were written for that liberal Viennese newspaper. But and he wrote for the Chartist press as well in English. A lot of it recycling things that he wrote for the Tribune. But the bulk of it is for the Tribune. The vast majority of it is for the Tribune, and the by far and away most continuous body of work. All of those other gigs were quite sporadic. What he wrote for the Tribune was a 10-year continuous body of journalistic dispatches from London, primarily about English politics, a grossly neglected body of work, including about the attempt to revitalize Chartism after 1848, under the leadership of a man who came close to being a kind of third addition to the Marx and Engels party. Certainly the closest thing that any Englishman ever came to that role, a man named Ernest Jones, who spoke German and was very closely aligned with Marx and Engels, and they helped to edit the paper. There were a couple of papers, the Notes to the People, the People's Paper. These were both things. These were labors of love. In other words, Marx and Engels were not paid for the work that they did for Jones. The Crimean War, which was the greatest event of the decade, was a major concern of Marx's journalism. But he really was talking about world history in the wake of 1848, from what was in effect its cockpit, London. And so thus you get the writings on China, the writings on India, at the occasion of the renewal of the East India Company's charter in 1853, the outbreak of the Opium War, of course the Taiping Rebellion, which was already taking place in the background of the Second Opium War, the Indian Revolt, or Mutiny as it used to be known in 1857, etc. All is being written on the basis of the London press. And that was Marx's method, really, was a kind of, if you will, immanent dialectical critique of the press of the day. His writing often took the form of a meta-commentary on press reports. The analysis that he gives of the desiccation of the bourgeois public sphere in the kind of Bonapartization of the press at that time is utterly neglected and brilliant. So Marx's work, Marx never wrote on the American Civil War except, so to speak, as a topic. He didn't write about the American Civil War in isolation from his other concerns. He always was writing in terms of the unfolding of a global Bonapartist counter-revolution and the emergence of a global Bonapartist state over the course of the 1850s. That state could be at war with itself and nevertheless be one thing. That was really the burden of his argument about the Crimean War. Don't be deceived by the fact that Bonaparte is at war with the Tsar, that they are in alliance by being at war with each other. And central to his argument also is the role that British politics is playing in anchoring the emergence of a global Bonapartist state. And this is another element that's either laughed at or dismissed or neglected in Marx's writings, which is his analysis basically about Lord Palmerston, which if you read biographies, and he'll say, well, Palmerston's in the pay of the court of St. Petersburg, or Palmerston's an agent of the Tsar. And naive biographers will sort of dismiss that as sort of manifestly absurd, which of course it is as a straightforward claim, but Marx means it as a political claim, of course. So that's the background of, in a sense, the project that this comes out of. I was going to say a few words about how we treat this material in Platypus Pedagogy. This comes up, of course, in our fall semester reading group. Usually we read the 1864 address to the First International, the Civil War in France, and the Critique of the Gotha Program together as a unit on Bonapartism. And really what that is about is Marx's treatment of the whole epoch from the quarter century from roughly 1850 to 1875. And so, and I'm sorry I'm going to read, I've got a lot of scrawled notes. I'm going to talk a little bit about that as a familiar frame that hopefully most of you know, but I want to sort of reinforce. And then I'm going to read a bit from the section introduction of the book that I'm currently finishing on the last section of writings. I have 8 sections of writings in that book, 8 sections of journalism, and it concludes with the writings in the American Civil War. So post-1848, the question facing Marx is what, in the light of the trajectory and disappointments of that revolution, is the task of proletarian socialist revolution. The relationship of the dictatorship of the proletariat and Bonapartism looms centrally. How the tasks of the dictatorship of the proletariat are demonstrated negatively by Bonapartism. If we take the period of 1851 to 1857 as a whole, from 1851 to 1871 as a whole, Marx and Engels are either observers or participants within a broader socialist movement. They're essentially observers in the 1850s because of how, especially after the collapse of the renewal of Chartism, there's essentially nothing to participate in. And Marx repeatedly refuses to, in a sense, waste his time with meetings in a period of complete counter-revolutionary hopelessness. And it's only after the Paris Commune that Marx and Engels, of course, having argued that Proudhonism and Blanquism in France, above all, have played themselves out and have come to and in some sense have overcome themselves. It's only after that that Marxism really begins to take a leadership role within international socialism. We begin to see this with the formation of the German SPD in 1875. The inaugural address to the First International of 1864 is, of course, the first polemic that Marx makes against the anarchists, in a sense, the running preoccupation of the First International, and is a core burden of his civil war in France on the Paris Commune. What has the working class been able to accomplish up to 1864? Civil and social action, unions and co-ops. This is a period of great development of English trade unionism, with which Marx is closely associated. Are more exemplary, Marx argues, than they are of practical significance. The self-organizing of the working class shows their ability to potentially become a ruling class. And in that sense, the social action of the English working class, but I'm also going to talk about the political action, especially with regards to the Civil War, do also what, or anticipate what the lesson of the Paris Commune is. Social and political action on the part of the working class demonstrate their ability to establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, taking a leading political and social role in order to organize socialism, which will, of course, involve both endeavors. The working class, my handwriting is terrible. Working class activity leads to the foundation, potentially, for Marx. He's looking forward to this, of a socialist party, which will be necessary to achieve socialism. From the 18th Brumaire forward, all of his writings insist upon the necessity of the dictatorship of the proletariat, and thus of leadership in the form of a mass socialist political party to counter, ultimately, what he calls the Society of December the 10th, the lumpen proletarian basis of the Bonapartist regime. The Bonapartism's basis in the morbid symptoms of capitalism. The American Civil War is the definitive crisis of the 1850s. There are many developments within the 1850s, most importantly, arguably, the development of Italian nationalism to, in a sense, signal the end of the counter-revolution, but the Italian national struggle is riven between the antinomy of a Bonapartist project sponsored, in other words, sponsored by Louis Napoleon and led by the King of Piedmont and Sardinia, King Victor Emmanuel II, to achieve Italian unification, and the Mazzinian naive Republican project. Mazzini, who, in a sense, for Marx, is a kind of living anachronism, a Republican in the wake of 1848, Democratic Republican. And that project that project of, in a sense, naive Mazzinian republicanism is most associated with the name of Garibaldi in the late 1850s. And Garibaldi, in sort of Garibaldianism, is certainly a big part of the global Civil War, the global American Civil War environment. At one point, Garibaldi is requested by an agent of the president to come to the United States to take over the command of all American armies in the Civil War. An offer he declines until the Emancipation Proclamation, at which point the offer is no longer standing. But the American Civil War is the place where the effects of 1848 being consolidated in the New World, in the Western Hemisphere, are threatened. In that sense, the entire seat of the bourgeois revolution coming out of the Atlantic world, inasmuch as the revolutions of 1848 were concentrated in Europe. Marx believes that they have played out in England in a complete desiccation of the parliamentary system and the emergence of a new form of ministerial executive government under Prime Minister Palmerston, which he thinks is consolidated by 57-58. And the American Civil War, which is of course prompted by the aggression of the Confederate States, who are seeking not simply to secede, but to reopen the slave trade and to extend slavery into territories where it's already been abolished. First and obviously in Cuba, and of course in the territories that over which there were so many disputes from the time of the Compromise of 1850 forward, Kansas, etc. But also, ultimately, Marx believes the fate of slavery in the northern states is at stake. In other words, he agrees with Lincoln's assessment in the famous House Divided speech that the House divided in North America cannot stand, but must either be one thing, all one thing, or all the other. Right. So, in this, of course, would be a catastrophic defeat, where the last republic, major republic on earth, still standing, and the home of so many revolutionary exiles who had immigrated to the United States. And of course, the United States having been the wunderkind of 19th century history in terms of its astounding dynamism, which dwarfed anything ever seen in the history of the world, and certainly anything seen in Europe at the time, whether in terms of population growth, economic growth, or indeed territorial growth. And at that point, the United States was coming to be the equal of England as a center of the Industrial Revolution, as was being seen, for instance, at the Crystal Palace exhibition in 1851, where American interchangeable parts were clearly in advance over industrial production. So the application of interchangeability to machine tooling, so-called American system, was becoming the admiration of the Industrial Revolution. So the American Civil War directly conditions and establishes the historical basis for the establishment of the First International in 1864. And don't let anyone tell you otherwise. It is not the uprising in Poland. The uprising in Poland is important. It is not the world historical event that is the American Civil War, which was an event that galvanized the whole of Europe and had hemispheric stakes in, of course, the western side of the Atlantic. Working class organization, prevented the British government from intervening on the side of the Confederacy in the US Civil War, thereby preventing French intervention because the French emperor could not intervene without, in a sense, British acquiescence. And this is the first act of socialist internationalism, especially given that this, of course, was not in the interests of the English working class. The war had put hundreds of thousands of workers either out of work or in part-time work. They were underemployed, both in the immediacy of the textile industry, which was starved of cotton, or in all the ancillary industries connected to it. At the same time, in Britain, the working class lacked a political party. So its political action in opposing Confederate intervention was led by default, so to speak, by the Manchester wing of British liberalism, just as the Union effort itself was led by American liberals whose only clear recognition of the crisis of their own politics had taken shape with respect to slavery and the advance of the slave power. Marx is completely aware of this and, in a sense, acquiesces in it. Marx helps to organize a meeting of London radicals and workers in 1862 and invites John Bright to be the main speaker. John Bright, of course, was the great Manchester liberal of the day and the very, in a sense, quintessence of what Marx would call liberalismus vulgaris, vulgar liberalism. So, and I'll just say a few more words and then I'll open it up for discussion. I won't be able to read much from the introduction to this section, I see. For Marx and Engels, as I've said, the crisis in North America marked a transition from the post-1848 counter-revolution to a time of renewed political possibility, a time that ramified beyond the cessation of hostilities in America through numerous dramatic events worldwide, culminating in the Paris Commune, the collapse of the First International, the collapse of Reconstruction in the United States. It contributed mightily to the turning of a decade that saw, apart from the momentous events in America, the 1861 emancipation of the serfs in Russia, the 1863-4 January uprising in Tsarist Poland, the formation of the First International, the 1867 passage of the Great Reform Bill, the Second Great Reform Bill in Britain, the 1867 Fenian uprising in Ireland, the Glorious Revolution in Spain overthrowing the rule of Queen Isabella II, the liberalization and then defeat of the Second French Empire, culminating in the Paris Commune, and the passing of free womb legislation, meaning all children are born free in Cuba and Brazil, the last remaining major outposts of the institution of slavery in the New World. Hal Draper and Ernie Haberkern have outlined Marx's sense of the immediate stakes of the Civil War in these terms. He not only considered support for the Union and abolition the only principled position, he considered a Union victory a matter of vital importance for the working classes in Europe as well as in America. A slaveholders' victory would postpone indefinitely, perhaps forever, the development of the Americas along bourgeois lines. The rise of an independent working class movement based on free wage labor would be postponed for a proportionate period of time. Instead of a political and moral example and an economic base for the progressive classes of Europe, which is what America had been, North America would become a vast pool of unfree labor. One gets the impression that most scholars treat Marx's Civil War writings as if they were rhetorical gestures, but then most scholars attribute to Marx a fatalistic view of historical development for which there is no evidence. Marx believed that slavery could triumph and set back for the foreseeable future any hope of progress. That's Draper and Havergal. Okay, I'll just conclude with a couple of perhaps familiar words of Marx's on the Civil War from the First International. As you may know, the first document that Marx produced for the First International, did I say Second International? For the First International. Good. We all read the address to the First International, the inaugural address. The second document that Marx produces for the First International is in his capacity as secretary. He writes the letter congratulating Abraham Lincoln on his re-election in 1864. And at this time, at a meeting of the First International, it would have just been the American flag. If resistance to the slave power was the reserved watchword of your first election, yours, Abraham Lincoln's, the triumphant war cry of your re-election is death to slavery. From the commencement of the titanic American strife, the working men of Europe felt instinctively that the Star-Spangled Banner carried the destiny of their class. While the working men, the true political powers of the North, allowed slavery to defile their own republic, while before the Negro mastered and sold without his concurrence, they boasted it the highest prerogative of the white-skinned laborer to sell himself and choose his own master, they were unable to attain the true freedom of labor or to support their European brethren in their struggle for emancipation. But this barrier to progress has been swept off by the Red Sea of Civil War. The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do for the working classes. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of the social world. Okay, I'll leave it at that for now. Shall I just moderate this myself?
If you want me to moderate it, I can. Whatever you want.
I'll just call on you.
Okay. Could you talk more about how the First International and English working class opposition to the Civil War kind of prefigures the problems of the Paris Commune? And I think it came out a bit in your presentation in terms of the political question and the question of political power and political action of the proletariat that might go against their immediate social economic interests, but I would appreciate more elaboration on that.
Okay. I think we have so much time that I'll just take them one at a time. Well, the attempt to reboot Chartism after 1848 intersects a major wave of union activity and strike activity that Marx and Engels find to be very hopeful in the year 1853. These are known as the Preston strikes. The slogan was 10% and no surrender. And what those strikes were about is they were very conservative strikes or modest strikes, but they gripped the whole of Northern England at the time, Manchester and the West Riding, etc., where workers were demanding the restoration of the wage levels that they enjoyed before the crisis of 1847. In that context, the Chartists, who have already passed a if you will, social democratic charter in 1851, in which, in addition to the 6 points of the charter, they talk about the necessity of rooting their demands and within the working class and serving as the political counterpart to a rising organizational effort. That takes root to a certain degree and kind of culminates in what is called the Labor Parliament of 1855. In Marx's comments to the Labor Parliament of 1855, which he was invited to speak at, are very interesting. And the idea was that that the working class would have a kind of counter parliament to that sat in Westminster. And so here you have a very clear sort of anticipation of the government in waiting idea that you will see take off in the Second International. And Marx learns a lot from this experience, but it ultimately collapses. It collapses for a lot of reasons, not least of which is the incredible prosperity of the 1850s. Though they understood, and they were very explicit about the fact that this was a prosperity strategy that they were engaged in. So that project has collapsed, which leaves, and that means the collapse of the last socialist newspaper in England, as far as working class independency is concerned. The People's Paper is sold off in 1857. And by that point, the older Chartist papers are either defunct or worse. For instance, one of them was used as a pro-Confederate organ. Reynolds Weekly was bought by Confederate agents and used for Confederate propaganda amongst the working class in the 60s. And so the working class, Marx describes this. Marx describes this, as extremely. Of course, he treats it as horrible and a great betrayal. And Ernest Jones is a renegade, and he's a general who's abandoned the field at the very moment of battle because in 1857 a great economic crisis does hit, which Marx thinks would have been the time for a more rapid growth of the second wave of Chartism, or social democratic Chartism. But what this means is that at the level of national politics, you get Palmerston with the outbreak of the Second Opium War is sort of pure provocation on the part of the English. It's unmistakable how, in a sense, fabricated the pretense for war is. And it's also clear that Palmerston had ordered it as in his capacity as Minister of War, or at least it's clear to anybody who's as sort of healthily paranoid as Karl Marx about the ruling class. And so this means that, and Palmerston is repudiated. He's voted out of office. There's a vote of no confidence in the Parliament because of the violations of international law. This is a kind of the last gasp of an old liberalism. It's led by people like Bright and Cobden, the Manchester liberals, but they get a lot of support, including from old Tory lords, for this, who recite international law in brilliant House of Lords speeches, which would be hard to improve upon. And Palmerston is voted back into office on a straight-up jingoistic program of supporting the men on the spot in China. It's known as the Chinese election of 1857. Marx treats this as the final consolidation of, if you will, parliamentary Bonapartism. So that's the background politically to a continuing effort to organize trade unions. in England. In other words, you have a politically leaderless, there's no political party of any kind. And the liberals who had, in a sense, opposed Palmerston, many of them many of them just joined Palmerston. For instance, William Gladstone had argued against the outbreak of the Second Opium War, and by the time he joins Palmerston's parliament, he's the attack dog for demanding Confederate recognition. So there's an abject prostration of liberalism for the most part, and the English working class is organizing its trade unions. The Great Strike is a builder's strike in London in '59. That's the immediate background for the growth of the trade, kind of a second wave of the growth of the trade unions after the crisis of '57, '58. They are, of course, about union. These are economistic demands, working class demands. They have no political leadership, but they do organize, and this gets to your question. They organize protests largely without clear political leadership from the middle classes, except for this remnant of Manchester radicalism. Both in the north of England and in London, beginning in the summer of 1862, in solidarity with the Union. Not so much in the Trent crisis. The Trent crisis, if you recall, in 1861, where there was an attempt to get Britain into the war on the basis of American violation of British neutrality. That was too early, in a sense, and the stakes of the war weren't fully clear. But well before the Emancipation Proclamation, and well before Union victories that gave the Emancipation Proclamation teeth, above all the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, which prompted Lincoln to issue the proclamation. The working class is organizing demonstrations against the government's attempts to bring itself to first of all, diplomatically recognize the Confederacy, and then on the basis of that recognition, declare the Union blockade to be invalid and break the Union blockade in the southern states. And in effect, at minimum, a tacit entrance on the side of the Confederacy, if not an outright military alliance with the Confederacy to vindicate its secession. So this is the working class, which cannot vote under the terms of the Reform Bill of 1832, speaking to the very heart of state policy, right? The ability to make war and peace. The state in its aspect as diplomatist and war maker. And it's that is the political action that you're talking about, right? Like I say, there is no party associated with this, and Marx is completely reconciled to that. He knows that he, of course, is in no position to conjure a party out of thin air, and he knows how important this action is. And this action is the basis for the granting of the vote to large sections of the working class in 1867. I mean, the liberal politicians acknowledge it. They say, look, the workers knew, in effect, the general will. They knew that we ought not to enter on the side of the Confederacy. They knew that the Union would win. They knew that this was a great war for emancipation, and the governing classes did not, and therefore we cannot withhold the vote. And so it's that's the direct impetus to the passage of the second, and in many ways much more important in terms of the history of mass democracy, Reform Bill of 1867. Does that answer your question? Perhaps more than you needed to know.
Wonderful.
Yeah, Wintie and then Ethan.
Okay.
So Spencer, you started off the talk by situating the Civil War within the global unfolding of Bonapartist counter-revolution. And while that counter-revolution was successful in Europe, it's obviously defeated in the US. So how does that actually, is there a direct link to that shaping the fact that in Europe, by the 1870s, we see the emergence of these mass social democratic parties led by international socialism, led by Marxism, while there seems to be a noticeable absence of that in the United States? Like, how would you say that the fact that, counter-revolution was successful in Europe, defeated in the US, how does that link up to what we would see in the 1870s?
I mean, the American conditions are, of course, very different than European conditions, and Marx takes that to be kind of definitive before 1848. He thinks that America is just this wonderland where there's still free land. They're still settling the country. He doesn't. You see this in a lot of writings around 1848. But of course, 1848, in a sense, does happen in the U.S. in the form of the Mexican-American War. And the way that the Mexican-American War triggers the question of slavery and the expansion of slavery. I'm glad that Jack Ross isn't here. I'm not an American historian, but we all know that from the Compromise of 1850 through the collapse of the Whig Party, and of course first the Free Soil Party and then the development of the Republican Party and the running of a Republican presidential candidate in 56 to Bleeding Kansas and the Dred Scott decision, that American liberalism on the question of slavery is in crisis. That the American the great line of Abraham Lincoln is that slavery needs to be placed in the course of ultimate extinction. This is the line that he has, I believe, in the Cooper Union speech of 1860. Slavery was already placed in the course of ultimate extinction as far as Thomas Jefferson was concerned. Right? Liberals already assumed that slavery was a badge of barbarism, of feudalism, that it would die out of its own accord. This is why someone like Adam Smith will make a very straightforward argument about how it's inefficient. He doesn't have to give a kind of overwrought moral argument. He thinks that, so to speak, the course of history is on his side. And so that's why I said the American liberals are only plainly aware of the crisis of liberalism around the question of slavery. Right? So if you listen, for instance, to, I recently posted on Facebook, for those of you who are my Facebook friends, if you read the Cooper Union speech of 1860, that's what Lincoln's talking about. He's saying, why are we debating the expansion of slavery, or whether the federal government has the right to control the expansion of slavery into federal territories, since we know that the founding fathers of this country passed the banning of slavery in the Northwest Territories in the 18th century. And Lincoln says, not only did not a single founding father of this country deny that the federal government had the right to control the expansion of slavery, nobody in the 18th century would deny that that was possible. So he's very clearly aware that there's some kind of regression from the 18th century to the 19th century, right? And that what people are saying about the Constitution is manifestly impossible to attribute to the founding fathers of the United States. So the developing of the crisis, of the secession crisis, over the course of the past 10 years, issuing into the election of Abraham Lincoln and the secession winter, means that the European powers believe that the Monroe Doctrine no longer applies, that the United States is no longer in any position to keep European influence out of the Western Hemisphere. And Spain reconquers Santo Domingo. Of course, the French sponsor an expedition to place the Emperor Maximilian on the throne of Mexico, which takes place. And there's all kinds of indications, as well as, of course, the kind of freelance imperialism of the Confederates, of Southerners in the 50s, that was called filibustering, where they would just lead private armies into Nicaragua and overthrow the government and say, okay, slavery's back in force in Nicaragua, William Walker. So this is the extension, what I'm calling the process of extension of Bonapartism over the course of the 1850s, into the Western Hemisphere. And it's brought to a crisis, of course, in 60, in the outbreak of war, in 61. Marx, bless him, never doubts that the Union will prevail. For a lot of, it's in the tea leaves in a lot of ways, that in a sense, the immediate ramifications of the coup d'etat and the end of the revolution in Europe is played out. But the whole time, Engels is, of course, Marx and Engels are writing to each other all the time, and their letters are really fascinating. Engels is always bitching about the Union generals, right? And Engels, of course, was a military mind. And what he wrote from the articles that he wrote, because he commonly ghost wrote for Marx, the articles that he wrote for the American press, the Americans thought was written by the commander-in-chief of the Mexican-American War, the American commander, I'm forgetting his name, Old Fuss and Feathers. What's his name? I'm forgetting that.
Not Zach Taylor, is it?
Not Zach Taylor. Zach Taylor died. But the commander, they thought that Engels's writings were by this brilliant American general who was in the London delegation because they were coming from London. Anyway, Engels's preoccupations are military, and says this thing isn't going to play out very well. The South keeps winning, and the Union doesn't seem to be able to muster a solid argument. And Marx will write back to him and say, I think you pay too much attention to the military aspect of this thing, right? Just wait till it's a wonderful use of it's a wonderful way that Marx uses racist terms in a completely subversive way. Wait till they put an army of N-words on the Potomac River, and then see what the Confederacy does. Wait till they turn this into a revolutionary war, which he equates with the arming of black people in 1862. And it's in that period leading up, of a series of Confederate victories, including Second Bull Run, that led to the invasion of Maryland, that Engels is sort of wringing his hands. So Marx has his eye on the politics of it, and he thinks that the formation of the Republican Party, if we were to look at it politically, he thinks that the formation of the Republican Party, the crisis of the American political party system, is sufficient to at least spark the turning of the international political tide. That the Republican Party, just with its argument about the non-expansion of slavery, will necessarily have to fight a revolutionary abolition war. This is way up, sometimes puts it. And that will drive into crisis the Bonapartist order in Europe. And it indeed does. I've spoken about the demonstrations in England. In France, where you couldn't really have a political demonstration, by the time that the end of the war is announced, and of course, within days of that, the news of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, students pour out of the Latin Quarter, and it's the first major demonstration in Paris, and march down the Champs-Élysées to the house of John Bigelow, the American ambassador to France, and deliver, having faced French troops, having faced, the emperor's troops to get there, street fighting, they get there and read out a long, obsequy or condolence letter about Abraham Lincoln, and asking that the American ambassador please convey the feelings of the youth of France to Mrs. Lincoln. And this is really breaking the ban on public street demonstrations for the first time in the Second Empire. And a series of liberalizations take place towards the end of the Second Empire before Louis Napoleon is overthrown. And all of the other events that I mentioned. Now, of course, Marx doesn't think that the Americans are going to, in a sense, solve Europe's problems. And he doesn't necessarily think that America is in a position to develop mass socialist politics. America has a specific role and function in a sense, the world order as he understands it. And it is a great republic, and it's, the last bastion of the bourgeois revolution, and it's sounding the tocsin for the revolution of the 19th century. But it's only sounding the tocsin for the revolution of the 19th century. The revolution of the 19th century has to be in Europe, right? And so all that I would urge you to think about is the way that for Marx, these are all, Marx isn't just interested in the end of slavery, any more than Marx is interested in the end of the Second Empire. Marx's interest, the whole interest, but obvious, this is to say something so obvious, but it needs to be said in the face of all stupid Stalinist nonsense about, the American destiny or French socialism, right? He's talking about the institution of the global, of the global dictatorship of the proletariat, right? That's what his goal is. That's what abolishing slavery is, a means to that end for Marx. It's not, it's the preoccupation of American liberals, right? But the American Civil War doesn't end with that, as we all know. It doesn't abolish slavery in a plain and simple way either, right? Marx knows that those liberal goals can't be achieved on their own terms, right? That the destiny of liberalism in that sense is in the hands of the working class, and the organized working class doesn't exist in the United States on anything like the same scale, right? It's led by the Republican Party, which is a cross-class collaborationist party, right? Abraham Lincoln believes in capitalist class and so forth. And Abraham Lincoln doesn't believe that there's an inherent class antagonism. Right? He defends free labor on those grounds.
My question is not significantly different from Wintai's, so we can proceed.
Yes.
Because we've talked about Lincoln as a Bonapartist, right? That it was self-evident that Lincoln was a Bonapartist, but of course Marx wouldn't use that language. So to what extent can we understand the Civil War as a kind of expression of the necessity of Bonapartism? How could it have been done? And like, what?
That was my question.
Okay, good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, like, what was I going to, sorry, that threw me off. The necessity of Bonapartism, that it had to be, like, Lincoln suspending habeas corpus, like, to put down the Confederacy. To what extent? I mean, because obviously the point is to overcome Bonapartism, but it's not a flat opposition, right? There's a necessity to what, like you outlined the regression between the 18th and 19th century, that maybe a Bonapartist state is necessary to uphold liberal ideals.
Right. So
Reconstruction too. He
Right.
was a dictator. It was a military dictatorship. I got in an argument with Jim Cregan about this last week on Saturday.
it's the Union troops still holding territory. Yeah. What's interesting is to see the way Marx is accepting, in a sense, directly, right? In 1861, 62, 34, really throughout the 1860s, there is no organized socialism, right? The working class is led by the likes of Abraham Lincoln and John Bright. The question is how, in and through liberal leadership, the crisis of liberalism will play out, right? So for Marx, it's not a problem. In other words, Abraham Lincoln is a stage in the development of the leadership necessary to institute the dictatorship of the proletariat. That's how he understands it, right? And that's the way you should think about all of his arguments about generals, right? Marx is really thrilled after the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation is issued, right? Where Abraham Lincoln says, I'm going to issue the Emancipation Proclamation in 3 months if you people don't put down your arms. Right after that, he fires George McClellan, who was a Democrat who was refusing to, in a sense, take the war into the heart of the South and burn down southern cities. And that's what Lincoln was coming to understand was going to be necessary, right? The kind of war that Grant fought. And that's really, I mean, the hardcore Bonapartism of Lincoln is the way he conducts the war. I mean, you can talk about the suspension of habeas corpus and the way he treats Copperhead Democrats, Browning, etc. But the total suspension of any liberal norm is the way that war is conducted on the Confederacy. This is the war that the generals studied to lay out the plans for World War I. Right? This was the first total war, and these were generals who were dwarfing the Napoleonic scale of war. They were thinking about it, of course, on a vast continental scale. And Napoleon never burned down cities, right? The way that Lincoln did. Right? He's commander in chief, and he's very happy that Atlanta was burned to the ground. Of course, Atlanta wasn't the only one. Burning Atlanta to the ground is what got him reelected, that Marx is celebrating in 1864. He wouldn't have been reelected without that victory. And so, he's a Bonapartist, right? The growth of executive power is, of course, staggering. What he's claiming as his war powers was unprecedented in American constitutional history, and lays the groundwork for, obviously, what Lincoln claimed as far as the inherent powers of the presidency, like Trump being able to slap around some Ukrainian president, right, until he, earns his aid, dwarfs that completely. And his Secretary of State, William Seward, when these Europeans would be like, well, we're just going to sell some ships to the Confederacy, or we're just going to ship some weapons to the Confederacy, and William Seward will invite these ambassadors in. And he'll light a match with a cigar, and he'll let the match burn for a while, and then light it. And he says, "You do that, and I'll wrap the world in flames." Right? If you think we won't, make this a world war, we will. Right? So this is, it's very clear what the stakes are. Right? The great achievement, in a sense, of the European working class was to create the illusion that American nationalist historiography has since, in a sense, played on, which is that they kept the Europeans out of the war. And so Americans just think this is some kind of family struggle. And of course, in the post-redemption period, it becomes a kind of unfortunate squabble that we best forget. But at the time, it was emphatically a world historical event. So that's all I would say is that, of course, for Marx and Engels, there would have to be a split of the Republican Party and all sorts of further developments in the development of leadership for socialism in the United States. They just don't think that it's going to play out that way. It's not a national revolutionary imagination at all, right? They're thinking about what are the effects in Europe, and then, well, maybe if the Paris Commune had succeeded, then Reconstruction would have been advanced further, right? And there would have been a radical transformation of the Republican Party, right? That's the way they're thinking, right?
That's much better than how I hear leftist academics address Reconstruction, because there's a lot of this language of like, well, Reconstruction would have worked if like these people in America had understood that you need to abolish private property or something, that it's because they didn't have this idea of communism, that they didn't give the 40 acres and a mule to every freedman. Yeah.
They didn't have the idea of communism.
Which is insane.
Well, they sure had it by the time of the
had
Paris Commune.
Yeah. Dallas
The fear
was
of the
founded.
Paris Commune was all over the world. And some of the best comments on it are Marx's interviews with American newspapers. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say Dallas was founded as a utopian socialist commune in
Uh-huh.
1945. The funny thing.
Well, I mean, I didn't get to it, but, of course, a lot of Marx's friends are officers in the Union Army. The German revolutionaries who had gained military experience, and because those are the ones who really had to get the hell away, right? If you'd taken up arms against the state, then you were ready for the firing squad in Prussia. And so a lot of former members of the Communist League, some of whom Marx and Engels remained friends with, like Joseph Wedemeyer, who rose to be a high-ranking officer, others who they had fallen out with, like August Willich, but who was really important for insisting on the non-return of so-called contraband slaves, slaves who ran into the Union lines, right, in defiance of Lincoln's orders. He was on Fremont's staff, and eventually became commander in the Missouri Theater. So this war is being fought by former 1848ers. This stuff would have been just perfectly understood in a Union camp, right? In a Union camp where you have the highest per capita consumption of printed matter by any army in the history of the world. These were highly literate places. They set up printing presses in these camps, right? And there, and it was there had been a massive wave, the largest wave of immigration in American history in the 1850s. So it was a multilingual, cosmopolitan army, and people were coming from Europe just to take part in it. Revolutionaries were coming just to take part in it, and so these guys are talking about it. Joseph Wedemeyer in 1865 is like, well, the revolution's just beginning now that the war's over, right? And he's talking about the Freedmen's Bureau, and he's talking about Reconstruction and so forth, and he's writing all this back to England. I mean, this is just the way, I think this is the way the history was actually made. In other words, the historians you complain of, which is almost always the case, or in fact, it's ultimately always the case that the problem with bad history is it falls below the consciousness of the people at the time.
People imagine a national failure of Reconstruction. That's what it is. That the failure of Reconstruction is like an American problem.
Well, also the Reconstruction failure is a problem of racism.
Yeah.
Right. People have, obviously, if you're a liberal and kind of naively liberal, like Abraham Lincoln, I don't think that most young people, as racist as, as people are, so many of them, they just can't imagine that people thought, well, when slavery's over, they'll just be citizens. And they thought when slavery's over, slavery's over. They didn't think, well, when slavery's over, then we deal with racism. No, racism is a whole other project, right, of Jim Crow. It's like people who think that slaves were taken from Africa because of anti-black racism. Right? It's completely asinine. There was a slave trade, and it was in Africa. That's where the slaves were available. It wasn't like, well, we don't like the Africans. It's just too stupid for words. But it is actually a projection of anti-racist racism on the past. Any other questions?
Anybody have questions?
Just a small, I guess, more than anything else, I guess it's not asking you speaking, but I was wondering then, if not racism, obviously, then is it really just the way Bonapartism plays out, that failure of reconstruction is that inevitable in light of this almost, I don't know, magnificent Bonapartism. I mean, you didn't call it that, but burning cities, that scale of government expansion or executive is the failure inevitable as part of that, or is that something else?
I mean, I guess the way I would put it is, and to avoid the weeds of Reconstruction, where I don't feel very comfortable, to talk about it just in terms of Marx, right? It's the way that, like, you could call it Marx's, naive optimism. Marx's 19th century optimism, what makes Marx, not Leonard. I can't remember, you got some Adorno head in here will remember the quote where Adorno says, well, Marx thinks that, like, people are rational, but they're sometimes swayed by propaganda. Whereas Lenin understands authoritarian personality or something like this.
You took the Horkheimer correspondence, the interview on a New Manifesto.
Right.
Where Lenin's the first to insist that we're social down to our very characters.
Right, and it's the way that Marx appears to us in the wake of the failure of socialism, right? He appears like, in many ways, a kind of hopeful liberal. Obviously, Marx's liberalism, exudes from him so plainly, first of all, because he began as a liberal individually, intellectually, because he's sort of in a primary way working through the crisis of liberalism and the rise of socialism as the very occasion of his thought. And because he is, as I'm talking about here, dealing with liberal leadership of the working class in a way that, it just predates the Second International. And so, so there's that, and then there's also the fact that Marx doesn't take the defeat of the 1848 revolution or the defeat of the Paris Commune in quite the way that Rosa Luxemburg takes 1914, right? He doesn't say these, and of course Lenin objects to that, right? He objects to the Junius pamphlets, sort of Cassandra quality. But nevertheless, the scale and sense of defeat and I don't think that Marx would ever say, though Engels did, it doesn't sound very Marxist to me to say socialism or barbarism. Right? I think Marx thought socialism was coming, right? Or more importantly, he thought there's no point in ever entertaining any other thought than how to attain socialism. And there's the single-minded maniacal character of it that he just doesn't even concern himself with anything else. So why doesn't he lament the the failure of the Paris Commune. He doesn't, because he thinks it's a stage in the growth of socialism. Right? And they ultimately, Engels will say the same thing in 1895, right? In the preface to the class struggles in France, where he says, well, we didn't know how much potential capitalism had left in it, right? Potential to build socialism, to build these parties, right? So they still see socialism as, in a sense, its failures are just unmistakably accruing in a project, or in the development of historical consciousness. Right? They don't see that as really issuing into a kind of definitive crisis, right? And I think that that's true of that whole, in a sense, epoch before the crisis of Marxism, right? Before 1899, right? So I guess that I would say that for him, when he thinks about the development of socialism to ultimately counter and, in a sense, replace Bonapartism with socialist Bonapartism, so to speak, critical Bonapartism, with the dictatorship of the proletariat. He sees that as a project that is going on throughout his life in a way that is just the way I think is the way you have to look at the history of 1848 to 1895, even though, Marx is the great big bearded head, with the fire from his fingertips, and he's the founder of Marxism, right? And there is obviously a very dark and ultimately the core of negative thinking is in Marx. He thinks that the working class is working through this process historically. And why wouldn't he? Right. Ultimately, why wouldn't he? Probably the darkest time he ever faced in his life is the period of the 1850s in terms of politically. This is a period of the growth of socialism throughout the 19th century. It's why it's a part of the 19th century that has to be brought to bear, I think. I mean, I think you have to recover Marx's optimism at some level to be a socialist. You have to, in a sense, bring the 19th century to bear critically on the 20th. Right, and in a sense, as heirs of postmodernism, we will always think, it's like when you heard the first time you heard your professor tell you that they had a critique of teleology, or that Marx is a teleological thinker. It was a hard-won teleological thinking. It was a teleological project that he was altogether in the process of building. Right, and the fact that in a sense, socialist destiny became improbable isn't Marx's fault. I mean, you could say, creating that project was the mistake. And that's what most socialists actually think. They think the project of creating the project of an international dictatorship of the proletariat was misguided from the beginning, if you really ask. Yeah.
I feel like in Platypus we often have this strong differentiation between the bourgeois revolution as the realization of the new social principle of labor, and proletarian revolution, this negation, this self-abolition of these categories.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, you've already kind of touched on this a lot, but can you tease through more how, in some sense, the American Civil War, it doesn't help to think of it as one or the other. it's not so it's that it's both in a certain sense.
I mean, I think the American Civil War is a great, it is important to study. Is as important as any revolution other than the revolutions of the 20th century to study, and in a sense, it anticipates the revolutions of the 20th century in as much as it can only advance or regress, and that's so plain in a way that's not true of the French Revolution, the Great French Revolution, for instance. The Civil War is a renewal of bourgeois revolution, right? Undoubtedly, it's very obvious that Abraham Lincoln taught himself to think by reading Thomas Jefferson. That is his entire political lexicon, is the American Revolution. And it's bringing that rhetoric and language of liberalism to a crescendo and crisis that makes the rhetoric of Abraham so brilliant. That a revolution will begin as a renewal of the bourgeois revolution, and that it will, in some sense, be motivated in a conservative way. That there's an impulse to restoration in modern revolution is very clear in the American Civil War. It's a restoration of union. It's a restoration of, right, it's the better angels of our nature calling to us from the battlefields of Bunker Hill, right, that are demanding the resolution of this crisis. And so in that sense, and it's to avoid the catastrophe of the extension of slavery across North America, right? Which was made palpable to people when they saw federal troops coming and arresting their co-workers, right? Arresting black men in northern cities who may or may not be runaway slaves, with the whole power of the federal government behind them. Right? There were instances where federal troops would seize upon so-called runaway slaves after the Dred Scott decision and take them to deport them back to the South. And after trying to break them out of the prison that would have, you had soldiers all around the holding cells for these men, and black flags would be laid out of every window in Boston, right, as they marched by. Right, it was very clear, right, that free labor as such, as in a sense the social liberty of that was the legacy of the revolution, was in crisis. And in a sense, the meaning of fighting for the freedom of labor was open-ended, right? So if you read especially like the preface to the first edition of Capital, the 1867 preface, it's just all about the American Civil War, right? He's still feeling the cannons firing across the city, clearly. And the whole section on the working day, if you read Capital there, right, at the beginning of that chapter, slavery is compared to forms of serfdom in Wallachia and Romania, in Eastern Europe. And at the end, the demand for the 8-hour day has been raised by the American working class, which is in the vanguard of the struggle for socialism. Right? So Marx does view Americans as in the vanguard of socialism, in the sense that they are asserting the prerogatives of free labor to, in a sense, control and dictate the terms of capital, demanding the 8-hour day, which that demand was first raised by veterans of the Union Army who had entered back into factory labor in Chicago in 1866 and 67. And Marx records that fact very dutifully at the end of the Working Day chapter on capital. So he's talking about, I mean, I don't know why Platypus education would give you the sense that bourgeois revolution and socialist revolution were two different things, because they're not, right? It is, in a sense, what Jack was talking about before. Right? The struggle for socialism is the demand to complete the bourgeois revolution in crisis, right? I like the old Spartacist slogan, complete the Civil War, as an American socialist slogan. An awareness that the project of the advancing of the project of liberalism is a political war, right? And in a sense, that socialism is the only defender of that legacy. That doesn't mean that I think that every time a socialist that I think that if Lenin curtails one or another bourgeois right in the course of the conduct of the Russian Revolution, that I think he's counter-revolutionary for doing so. I think that's to fail to understand, thinking about strategy and tactics in a revolutionary context. But I would fault Lenin if I ever thought that Lenin, for instance, didn't mark such a curtailment of bourgeois rights as a retreat, which he never does fail to do. Right? It's that kind of question, right? When you're dealing with the crisis of liberalism in reality, right? It doesn't just mean that you become some kind of spiked online, enlightenment mongerer, and that's the full lexicon of your politics, because it won't do. And socialism is authoritarian, right? It's a crisis of liberalism inherently. The working class organizing is a crisis of liberalism. One that Adam Smith thought was, so to speak, a tension over the wages of labor, one that Marx thought had risen to the level of a crisis of the project of liberalism itself, with the self-organization of the working class political force that it signaled that in. So that's what I would say in terms of sort of keeping it on in Marx's terms. Probably time to end.
We can end it here. Thanks, Spencer.